Compliance by definition is local, while blockchain by definition is global. We often get requests from legacy companies that are interested in accessing the global markets or interested in gaining access to new sources of revenue. So I wanted to ask you both, from your perspective, how global is blockchain?
Well, of course, blockchain is extremely global, but there are naturally challenges in, the compliance space with anti-money laundering. And, as we know, there's quite a lot going on in the world right now, which is definitely making changes in our industry. And, blockchain is a part of that.
I think there's two components of it. One, from a consumer side, thinking about where you're participating with the blockchain, with the crypto community, what organizations and where they're domiciled actually matters. Just for instance, if you're a U.S. person and you have some issue with frozen assets, stolen assets, some sort of customer support issue, stolen funds, your ability to effectuate any sort of resolution is probably pretty dependent on where your VASP that you're dealing with is, and what their terms of service are. The other component there from the VASP, from the business side, is the jurisdictional arbitrage. So there are certainly challenges with operating in the U.S. We've got lots of different and new regulatory regimes. We're looking at MiCA in Europe. We're looking at VARA in Dubai, just a couple of examples. There's lots of inputs that go into where you want to set up shop. And it's not always super obvious. I think, for instance, dealing with a small regulator, Liechtenstein being one I'm painfully experienced with, having a small regulator, while maybe it's easy to get licensed, that small regulator also might come down to your office on a Tuesday and ask to see all of your transactions or customer files. So
that's really helpful, guys. I mean, from what you're saying is you have to think a bit differently depending on the jurisdiction because it's localized. But I was just wondering if you could pull out some sort of general themes on what people should be keeping in mind when they're looking at AML, sanctions, fraud prevention. So if there are sort of general themes coming through globally. Yeah,
and I think maybe we touch on this in a little bit, but the traditional crypto bro or 2017-18, hey, regulations aren't clear. I don't know what the regulations are. It's a little bit disingenuous. Some might say nonsense. Your obligations to not do fraud, so don't do fraud, pretty easy. To protect customer assets and their information, and not letting people conduct financial crimes on your platform, or at least doing the best you can to prevent it. Those are pretty basic principles across all the regulatory regimes.
Okay. So in light of that, what would be the ideal jurisdiction to start a new blockchain platform?
Well, I think the question of what's ideal is really going to depend, as always, the devil's in the details. I mean, it really depends on what kind of blockchain company you're building. What do you want? What are your goals? What kinds of customers you want? As my colleague said, sometimes you may think, oh, I want U.S. customers, so I want to do it here. But, there are, as we noted, complications that can arise. In terms of the regulatory regime, though, as Mike just said, the AML regulations are very clear, and they apply across whatever type of blockchain company you want to build. If you are a money services business, if you're a payment, if you're dealing in any way with money of any type or anything that could be perceived as value, art even, all of that is going to fall under some form of the anti-money laundering compliance regulations that exist today. And for the most part, they are fairly similar across certain jurisdictions, across the EU, across the US. Obviously, don't do money laundering. But the way that you would build a compliant money laundering, anti-money laundering compliance program is very similar. You need to have KYC, you need to have sanctions, you need to have a transaction monitoring system. And really the best way to go about that in whatever jurisdiction you're in is to make sure that you start building your house with an architect. I say that to say you need to have an idea of where you want to go, where you want to be, and you need to build in those policies and procedures, particularly if you're planning on scaling at all. Even if you think you're only going to have 2 customers, I've definitely worked with folks that those 2 customers turn into 10,000. So you need to be thinking about how you scale, and the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to make sure you have a really good, solid team behind you. You need to have lawyers, as someone mentioned in one of the panels earlier. You need to have a risk manager. You need to have someone who's got a lot of familiarity with, anti-money laundering compliance. And these people are out there, they exist. Many people have crypto experience now, came from traditional banking, so they know how to build these programs. But you need to start with building that program and sort of anticipating where you're going to go.
Okay. Can I ask you a question? So right now we're talking about more traditional platforms, like a trading platform. What about people in the trenches building code and building new tools? How do you fit new technology like a validator? How do you build something like that globally and do so in a way that doesn't lead you to being prosecuted by the Netherlands or the United States? What are the things to think about, government principles?
Yeah, I'll chime in on that. So I think if we're talking about where we want to set up shop, ultimately, if we're building something, there's a pretty valid perception that the U.S. may not be the best place to be building anything right now because of some pretty liberal interpretations by politicians and lawmakers on what an obligated business is to different laws. We've got Hong Kong and the UAE, who I think have set up pretty good, I don't know if I want to call them incubators, but, some regulatory regimes that are friendly to development. Oftentimes in those 2 specific areas, and we're doing a lot of work in those spaces right now, a lot of the licensing procedure is just kind of paperwork heavy. There's not a lot of testing for effectiveness for compliance based on the actual product that you're building at this stage. Now, this will probably change over time. I'm not sure, if you've got a position on how the FCA is treating anything. MiCA, I think, for developers is still a little fluid in Europe, and how those jurisdictions are going to perceive. I think we talked about, just building code, how we're going to perceive, code platforms like Tornado Cash that sort of have a bad reputation, but maybe the facts and circumstances don't necessarily support, increased scrutiny based on what they're building.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. The FCA is quite an interesting one because it's sort of, it's got a role in the UK. It's quite, historic regulator, well established, which sort of has that badge of quality. So it's not like perhaps some other regulators who sort of just want to get the business in and are less fussed about it. But also there's a big push politically in the UK at the moment to increase competitiveness of and the attractiveness of the UK as a market, particularly in financial services and in the digital sector. So there's sort of, the UK, I guess, is trying to make itself just a bit more permissive than the US and move a bit more quicker than the US, but not get dragged into sort of a race to the bottom as it would see it with other regulators generally. And in some ways, although this might have changed by the end of the year, the industry is fortunate in that in the UK there's a Prime Minister who's very keen on this sector, at a personal level, and it's an area where he really wants the UK to grow, and sort of, to the extent that he legitimately can sort of lean on the regulator and to sort of move in that direction and to make sure that the laws go through Parliament that are needed. But in general, the UK's position is it wants to maintain its sort of reputation for quality, but it's got a real eye on sort of how it can attract business and moving forward. And the points you make about the US, that's definitely noticed in the UK, who really see this as an opportunity to sort of effectively, steal a march on the US. it's less concerned about stealing a march than some of the other jurisdictions.
And I would say from a developer technologist standpoint, if there's one component of regulation and compliance that I would pay particular attention to, especially if I don't think I qualify as a financial institution, are the local consumer protection laws. So understanding how my product affects consumers, what type of consumers are sort of educated enough to be using my product. Am I actually marketing my product to the appropriate crowd, or am I targeting my whatever the widget is that I'm building on the blockchain? Am I targeting that towards 80-year-olds who barely know how to turn on a computer? Probably not great.
Yeah. So I'm going to say a few words about Latin America, as it's a region that I cover. Whether you are the main actor or a service provider in the financial industry, a programmer, it's important to find the right match for you. So there are 33 countries in the region. So within the Caribbean, I would say the Bahamas is carrying the flag. It has a very solid legal system, and the regulatory entities are in line with the legal system. And then we have Mexico, which is also very solid. When we look at the other countries, we see that blockchain is in their radar, usually because they tax tokens, any instrument, or sometimes they issue warnings because it's something new to them. So different countries, select different regulators for overseeing the industry. So for example, in Brazil, it's the central bank, and then we have other countries that don't have any. So we have the combination between the law, regulators, and the financial sector. So for example, Panama has the first two, but the banking industry hasn't caught up yet. So I would look at it not as one, but as 33 opportunities. Yeah.
All right, so we've discussed a bit how, one of the things you're looking at when you're setting up is what jurisdiction you want to be based in. And I appreciate you've spoken a bit about the importance of getting the architecture right at the bottom. But I was wondering if you could provide a bit more around how a new entity, how you'd recommend they're structured, both sort of from the legal perspective in terms of those sort of nuts and bolts of it, but also from more of a cultural and conduct, sort of architecture perspective.
Well, always culturally, you should be loving compliance and always wanting to have a fantastic compliance program. Otherwise, you may see the two of us who come to help fix things. I think that's certainly, you want to start with that. I think a lot of companies, they start with, I have a developer, I have, a head of product, I have, these people who are going to build the thing. And then you have very limited back office. And so I feel like, and back office would be your general counsels, your compliance people. And I think that really you need to ensure that piece of it is structured well. And so that means, in a lot of cases, just reaching out to your community and saying, hey, does anyone know people who do this? Start from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think if you're just starting from scratch, and I'll just paint two different scenarios here. If you're building something from scratch, again, somebody said it earlier, we just repeated it, again, call a lawyer. It should be step one. And in those cases, it's pulling in an adult in the room early on. And maybe that just is your outside counsel or in-house counsel. But have an adult in the room early on. If your chief marketing officer is also your chief compliance officer, probably an issue. I'll just put it out there. And I think the cultural piece is part of it as well. Depending on where you're building, lots of early stage companies try and offshore their compliance functions. While it can be sort of efficient from a money standpoint, there are some offshoring challenges with regulatory compliance in your compliance operations and process flows, KYC investigations, activity report filing. So I think that's sort of scenario one. So again, just hire somebody qualified, get an adult in the room, and have them help you grow it. And frankly, an adult that will help you scale as well. I think the problem in the I think, earned reputation that compliance people have, and certainly anti-money laundering professionals have, is, they're hammers that see nails everywhere. And that's probably inappropriate to your business as well. So having a sort of business forward compliance officer or compliance advisor is really important early on. In my 3 years as the CCO at Bitrex, if I had to do that first year over again, I probably would have been a little more aggressive on certain aspects of our program when communicating them and implementing controls with the regulatory posture we were under. Mm-hmm. From hey, we are an existing blockchain business, and we are looking to move into a new jurisdiction. Again, talk to a lawyer, preferably one who understands those local laws. And if you've already got a robust compliance program and you're just looking to introduce yourself into a new jurisdiction, have strong service level agreements. Make sure that your local staff and wherever your new jurisdiction is has appropriate authority and responsibility over the back office operations that may be happening in a totally different country with the parent company. And then, I think establishing good proactive relationships with your regulators early on is really important as well. Somebody mentioned it earlier, don't surprise your regulators. They dislike that. They get scared and fearful and start writing consent orders.
Okay, so how does consumer protection look like in crypto?
Yeah, so I'll sort of lean towards the crypto exchange, like the financial component of it. It's resourcing, and it's just abiding by the principle of, if something goes wrong for one of your customers or users or whatever you want to call them, that they have a reasonable outlet that they can reach out to your company, speak to somebody, not a chat bot, and who's actually going to solve their problem. I think one of the other things we're seeing now, 2017, 2018, all of the, most of the crypto space was confused because we didn't know AML was a requirement. All right, great, we're past that. Well, now lots of people have really fantastic AML programs now and anti-fraud programs. And they've got all of these technological heuristics and alert systems that freeze accounts to prevent potential fraud or illicit activity. But then they've got a bunch of customers, whether they, are problematic or not, with just assets frozen on some platform. And here's what happens when those customers can't retrieve those assets that you are potentially not legally allowed to just hold in perpetuity. If they can't get them back, guess who they're calling? They're calling their local, banking regulator, usually here in the US, but they're calling, they're filing complaints with the regulators. And then those regulators are asking, what are you doing to protect consumers? You can't hold on to this forever, especially like victims of fraud, elderly abuse, other financial abuse. So, the TLDR for me is make sure you have a sufficient process to handle inbound consumer complaints, actually deal with them, and hire enough customer support staff to, a minimum, give prompt communication to your customers' users.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also an increased focus on consumer protection right now in a lot of areas. And I think, one of the ways that you can work with that too, like you said, of course, to have good customer service, but also real oversight. So have a great board and be able to look at, this holistically from a 50,000-foot view and say, we have this tranche of consumers who are all reporting the same kind of problem, and not just a customer service line where someone's just writing it down. Someone who's looking at it, from a full oversight perspective and what needs to be happening here. And then, a board that you can talk to, that you actually can talk to and say, look, we are having this problem. Do you have these experiences? Can you help provide some real guidance for us? And I think that's maybe some of the difference between, say, a traditional financial institution and crypto, is I feel like a lot of the blockchains really do rely on the experience of their board. So I think it's really important to get, in all regulatory aspects, in AML, in privacy, in consumer protection. So I think it's important to have a board that's really knowledgeable and can also provide oversight, but also advice.
That's really interesting. Because I always think with regulators, there's sort of two bits of the market that they really care about. And crypto sort of really touches on both of those. One is consumers, as you say, there's nothing a regulator hates more than the idea of the 80-year-old vulnerable granny who's sort of fleeced. And crypto, especially some of the scare stories around it, sort of lent itself to that. And the other area which I think regulators always care about is sort of too big to fail market infrastructure, and crypto again, lends itself to that. So it's easy to see why, the regulators are so concerned. Plus, they've got to, and they've done a better job with it over the years, but sort of getting up the learning curve themselves to get themselves comfortable and understand it. In the UK, for example, the regulator, and this is across financial services, has in the last year introduced something called the consumer duty, which is basically just completely focused on delivering good outcomes with consumers. So it's just a general rule, regardless of what sort of financial services company you are, that one of your duties is to deliver good results for consumers, and being able to evidence that. So you can see from a crypto perspective, if we park the sort of nuances around how crypto and crypto companies are authorised and regulated in the UK, but that's going to key as they become more and more heavily regulated to protect consumers. So I guess my question for you guys is, we talk about consumer protection, and we've spoken a bit at a high level about, the sort of motherhood and apple pie features that one should have, but at a sort of quite a granular level, are there like 2 or 3 things where you're saying, actually, if I was going into somewhere, it might not change everything overnight, but these are just a couple of things which I'd say, actually, if we just tweak this here, that would really help from a consumer protection perspective?
Yeah, I think aside from an inherently reactive process of customer support that I just mentioned, I think the more proactive one and the biggest one is having a solid product offering, product acceptance listing process. So there's lots of interesting crypto products out there of varying levels of utility and use and good for the world, and potentially, most of us in this room would probably say that some percentage of those we could argue are scams and frauds, just trying to separate people from their money. And then there's legitimate projects. And I think if you are an intermediary or you are offering any of these products to consumers, one, having a thorough compliance, utility, technical evaluation of the product that is documented and approved, at some senior management or potentially board level, depending on the size of your company, really makes sense to evidence to regulators. Yes, we are keeping in mind all of these consumer protection issues. So if you're evaluating a token and you're finding evidence of pump and dump schemes, fraudulent marketing on social media, or the token team will only communicate via WhatsApp. Sorry, it's a little personal aside. Those are all indicators, right? And if these were knowable characteristics of a token prior to you listing it, and you listed it anyway without regard to, hey, my customers are potentially going to get scammed from this and be separated from their money or other assets, we need to take a hard look at whether or not we actually list that product.
So how should providers and vendors conduct themselves at the beginning of a new relationship or throughout the life of the product?
I'm a little fuzzy there. I mean, listen, anybody you're partnering with, whether it be a developer, a third-party service provider, understanding what their business value is to you, what their business value is to your consumers, what that interaction is between your products, services, your regulatory posture, and your customers. I mean, that's sort of the overarching theme on, who you're letting into your organization, whether it's sort of arm's distance or they're embedded within and helping you offer products and services to customers.
And I would say on that note, when you have any vendors, any third-party vendors, I think there's also a lot of regulatory scrutiny on third-party vendors for all financial institutions right now. So I really think you've got to have a really strong service level agreement. It's got to be really clear what each entity's obligations are, and then definitely take a deep dive on any vendor that you're using, understand certainly their anti-money laundering compliance program, how it works, because you will still have the same obligations, even if you were using a third-party vendor for different things. So just make sure any third-party vendor that you're using, you really have those strong agreements and that you understand what they're actually doing. And like you said, the culture of their culture of compliance. You know, if a third-party vendor comes to you and says, "Oh, you don't have to worry about this. We're going to take care of all of this," you should be your red flag should be up.
Yeah.
And say, you know, everything should be transparent between you and their company. Of course, you know, there's IP, but you know, it should be very clear how the things are working, what the obligations are.
Yeah,
I think a really good example of that is, you know, most companies perform sanction screening using a third-party vendor. You know, most people in the U.S. will talk OFAC, but you know, apply across the board. Most people do not have have not hired somebody who just goes to the OFAC screening site and like enters names, right? Everything is hopefully automated and tuned with some level of algorithmic fuzziness for matching. I'm trying to think what I can actually say in public. So I have.
It. You can say that. You should test what they say.
I have witnessed a case where the screening entity, the third-party service provider who was supposed to be screening for sanctions, had some switch flipped off and just wasn't monitoring for some period of time. Obviously problematic. Didn't turn out great for the company. We'll sort of leave it there. But even things as routine as, well, you know, if you're using XYZ tool, how often are you actually updating their backend systems when OFAC updates the SDN list? And you know, what is the time gap there? And then are they actually screening everything across your population when there is that update? And having that level of detail in the service level agreement is really important.
Mm-hmm. So I understand you both operate across jurisdictions, and when it comes to compliance, it's about identifying the weakest link. How far do you go when you identify compliance in your counterparties? Can that have a spillover effect on you if they are not in compliance?
Yeah, so I think maybe what you're alluding to is, you know, what is your if you are an obligated financial institution, or maybe not, right? Everybody's got some level of compliance obligations, and you're bringing in a third party who is integral to your operations. I think one, making sure they have a similar risk appetite and compliance posture to yours. If you're partnering with a vendor or financial institution payments or any other intermediary, understanding that, hey, we're sort of simpatico in how we approach compliance. If there's a wild mismatch, it's not going to work. And I think just from a practical evaluation standpoint, you can usually tell pretty quickly if somebody matches your hopefully really strong compliance posture. You know, just ask for their policies and procedures, and you can usually tell if they're just cut and pasted from the internet, and like they're not customized to their actual risks. Or again, you know, the example, I only say this because I've seen it at least twice where, you know, our chief marketing officer is our head of compliance. And, you know, they're, no offense to 23-year-olds, but they're 23, you know, like, there's lots of 23-year-olds that are smarter than I am, so that's fine. But, yeah, so, I think that's it. Making sure that your risk appetite and your compliance posture match all of your partners within your ecosystem.
And their products and services, right? So you may be a company where most of your clientele is based in, you know, the UK, but the vendor that you're using, all of their programs are aligned around identifying US actors. Yep. So you have to kind of look through and make sure it works for what you are offering. You know, I always say, you can do this too. You should hire someone who is very smart to do it. But if it's just, you're starting a startup and it's just you and 3 people, you can still look through and try to understand, like, okay, they're mostly doing sanction screening on, UK entities, which have some similarities, but also have different lists than in the US. And it's, and you can think to yourself, okay, this is not fit for purpose. That's something I talk about a lot with folks. Like, make sure what you are getting and buying is fit for purpose, which means understanding your risk profile, understanding what you need this product to do, and making sure that it is aligned to what you need it to do.
And do you usually focus on the source where the service is provided, or where the service gets to? If you have a company in the US that has customers in Asia, do you help them with compliance across the board, or do you focus on the issue?
Yeah, it's interesting because, if you're a company, if you're a VASP, again, like I know it's a little bit financial institution, crypto-centric, but, are you actually going to go get licensed in 160 countries? Probably not, though I feel like some companies are making that attempt, and good on them. But, understanding from a product aspect, hey, is this product actually okay to sell, offer to customers who reside in these different jurisdictions? And I think maybe coming the other way is really interesting. Something common that I've seen in industry is are US companies who say, well, the SEC has taken a position on these certain tokens, or some regulator has said these tokens are problematic, so we're not going to offer them in the US, but we're going to partner with another company who will offer them globally. But that partner company has no controls, and they're not preventing US persons from accessing those products, and that's extremely common. And then what's your liability there when it's not if, it's when somebody finds out that you are either through an intermediary or some sort of nested VASP situation, de facto, and offering products that are outside of regulatory bounds to U.S. persons. And every jurisdiction is a little nuanced in how they treat these things. Here, it's just it's obviously prominent because of all the SEC discourse.
And I think that was one of the issues that the CFTC brought up in the Binance case, right? Is that they had another entity, Binance US, and how those two entities were interacting and what their customer bases were.
Yeah, it's always like it's a fun sort of thought experiment of, well, we're offering these products that are extremely traceable on the blockchain, but we're going to sort of hide it through these intermediaries that, everybody, my guy Jason in the back can probably go track down in about 10 minutes, right? So it's a little bit of a mismatch of, or this disingenuous approach sometimes.
Okay, great. Are there any questions? Okay.
So I'm Spiro Antonopoulos from Solidus Labs. I can't ask this question without it sounding like I'm shilling our own bag, but I noticed that we've talked about AML, CFT, talked about consumer protection fraud, but haven't talked at all about trade surveillance, which is one of the key pillars of your exchange or OTC desk. So how do you think about that? Or, we know it's a requirement in certain jurisdictions, other jurisdictions probably coming. How much is it coming out? Where do you see the majority of your clients? I'm actually very curious in Latin America, because I haven't studied the regulatory regimes there, understand if it's coming, it's being discussed. So I just think trade surveillance should get some of its due in this panel.
No, I think that's fair, and I think I just very briefly touched on it from a pump and dump market manipulation 2-second note earlier. And being a former client of yours, frankly, I'll, from the U.S. perspective, if you were an MSB, it is not an actual requirement, and that's sort of the mismatched regulatory regime that we have here. Should it be? Probably, right? And we always treated it as, yes, we are one of the first in the space to be utilizing this tool, and it was a good differentiator for us to have positive conversations with our regulators. We are seeing it in Hong Kong, Dubai. I think Mika has some component of it, though I'm a little fuzzy on it, frankly. you're seeing it more in market surveillance included more globally. But here in the U.S., just the way we're licensed as MSBs most of the time, it's sort of one of those, hey, nice to have, looks good, but not actually a requirement. I don't know about LATAM or.
I find in the region, because this is slightly within blockchain, but a little bit off too. So I would say in the blockchain space itself, there isn't much. I know in Spain, they are catching up with the US, and also in Colombia, and I know Argentina has the intention to do so. But I don't think they're there yet. When we were talking, as we prepared this panel, I learned that the region is catching up with Mike.
And by the way, that falls under the don't do fraud, don't let other people do fraud. So even if it's not a specific regulatory obligation that you must conduct market surveillance like you're a broker-dealer, if you're just letting free-for-alls happen on your platforms or with your products, that sort of catch-all fraud piece, DOJ likes that a lot. That's pretty fun. So that's the warning. Good shill, by the way.
Yeah. So there was a question here before. Would you like to?
In addition to the questions around sort of AML compliance and sort of the compliance around client service businesses, are you seeing your clients doing that sort of technology sanction requirements as well? Just given the focus on the technology and blockchain space, obviously the U.S. has certain regulations around not using integrity as sort of sort of servicing U.S.-based customers. I'm just wondering if that's built in the state program or is it consumed separately?
So from the American VASP perspective, what you're talking about, you would largely see in like ITAR, EAR, import-export control programs. I mean, no, you're not really seeing those. But what would be incorporated would be the entities that you're dealing with and where they're located. And, it is pretty narrow from that sanctions perspective. I have not seen certain specific types of technology that are being used for these platforms. I just haven't observed it.
There was some question about that in the 90s related to PGP and cryptography. So there's a question, there are some questions around import-export regulations potentially with advanced cryptography. Now, I think there are some First Amendment issues with restriction on code itself, but particularly if you instantiate those things into hardware, that's where you start to see import-export. I think in order to get back on track, we're going to have to end the panel here.
So I would thank you, Ian, Mike, Ayana. Just a closing remark. When it comes to compliance, what's right and wrong is usually the same everywhere. It's the how that changes. And for that, you have the experts here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.